Welcome to podcast number 5 of Bass Talk with Hagen and Hayes. Today's topic is thumb position. So, Susan Hagen, tell me about thumb position.
Thumb position. Well, David Hayes, that's a great topic. Um,
Thank you.
I think thumb position is one of those areas that when I was growing up, and I think it might have been the same for you, you don't even know it exists for a while. And you certainly don't
Yeah.
play up above that, G harmonic on the G string. Gosh, I didn't play there for years. And I certainly didn't have a strategy at first. The first time I ever played there was for the Lieutenant KJ solo
Oh,
in the
really?
Prokofiev. Yes. And I remember we got the music. I knew nothing. Played the first movement. Everything was great. Turned the page to the second movement, the romance. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, it's a solo and it's treble clef. And oh my God, I don't know those notes. I played piano, so I knew the notes, but
Yes.
not how to do them on the bass. So that first rehearsal was a lot of one, 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 and praying.
That's got me a long way, that fingering.
Oh yes, the one one saves you. Um, so I think, I mean, I'm curious. What was your first encounter with thumb position?
Yeah, I think exactly the same. Um, when I was growing up, you learned your Simandl, whatever, and then we moved on to Simandl Book 2. So at least we went into thumb position. But really, there was no system. And it was just finding notes. There were no talk of handshakes. Like, like we talk about positions, first
Right,
position, second position. But up in thumb position, it was just notes.
right.
And we had no idea. And then Petrarchi brought out this book, a simplified, I can't remember, it's a thumb position. And that I think is as important as Simandl's method, because he suddenly brought all these ideas together. And I'm not sure if they were his own ideas, but suddenly they were all in one place. And we had 3 thumb positions. We had chromatic hand shape with a semitone between each note. It's a half step between each finger, and then semi-chromatic and diatonic. And most of the music you ever play will fit into those 3 hand shapes. And then suddenly there was some technique. But when I first started out, it was just finding notes, and if you couldn't pitch it, you couldn't find it.
Right.
It was so funny when I look back. And I once remember one London bass teacher. I talked to him and I said, what fingering do you do for that passage? And he said, you just play it. Oh, well,
That's helpful.
yeah, thank you for that. That's yeah, I feel much better now. That's really good.
It's funny in my teaching with my students, down in the what my teacher used to call the money positions, so the
Yes.
lower positions, not thumb position. I tell my students don't do the hop and pray where you just release your hand completely from the fingerboard and pray that you land right. But I remember with thumb position, I did the slide and pray the whole time, just praying I would land right. And I thought, well, if I slide, I can kind of hear where I'm going. Um, and I remember taking the Prokofiev to my teacher, and she said, "Oh dear God, how are we going to deal with this?" So she basically taught me how to play the notes in the solo.
Yes.
And she said, when this is done, when you get this under control, the Petrarchi, I think it's simplified higher technique for
That's
double
it.
bass.
That's the one.
Um,
Yeah.
I bought the book, and it's in the way of Samandel. It's very like analytical and dry
Yes.
and methodical, and but I was so excited, and we started talking hand shapes a little bit. And when it came time for me to start teaching it,
Mm.
when I first started teaching, I went along with Samandel, so we didn't approach thumb position. I'm like, oh no, you won't get there till much later. You need to be really
Yes.
solid in the money positions. I wonder in retrospect if that was just not feeling secure in how I was going to teach it.
Mm.
But then I decided, okay, I can do this. I can tackle it. So I took my favorite little exercise. I have it in my book. I make all my
Mm.
students learn it. I call it Neener Neener. Ed Barker taught it. He called it the left hand chromatic warm up. Max Dimoff teaches it and calls it like Max's Madness. Everyone has this
Yeah.
same sort of 1 2 4 2 1 4 2 4.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, I can do this in thumb position, and instead of 4, I use 3, and just start learning
Mm.
where are the half steps.
Yes.
And so I say to my students, I used to give them, well, now it's all in my book, so I just give them the book. But I would say to them, all right, I have a sheet that I would hand
Yes.
them of thumb position thoughts. And one was, if your thumb is not on the string, it's not thumb position.
Mm.
Meaning, you can't just leap up there and have your thumb, 12 inches away from everything else and just
Yes.
press down with your fingers randomly, because then you can't have the arches and
Mm.
the left hand posture, the hand shape's just
Mm.
not going to be there, and you won't have the strength that you need. So I teach them my lovely Neener Neener. I made 3 versions of it because that's how I roll. And they're all always half steps, because I really like to drill in having thumb 1, 2, and 3 a half step away from each other, so that
Yes.
then we can blow that out of the water later. But I have them do 1, 2, and 3, and thumb is just sitting on the string, so that they can start to figure out, where does your thumb sit on the string,
Mm.
and start building a callus. Because I
Yes.
remember, I had my thumb pressing down right near my fingernail, and my fingernail got worn away in like a crescent
Yeah.
shape, and it was very uncomfortable.
Mm.
And so I say to my students, I don't think you want to be on the knuckle, because there's no buffer, there's no cushion there, and
Mm.
you don't want to be on your fingernail, so you have to find somewhere in between there that's comfortable.
Yeah.
So without using thumb on its own, it gives you a chance to figure out where is comfortable.
Mm.
Then I make them play what I call version 2, or 2.0. And that version uses thumb 1 and 2. And 3
Yes.
just hovers, and they start learning how to keep the third finger close to the string, but what to do with it when they're not playing. It also helps them figure out what to do with your fourth finger, because that
Yes.
fourth finger can carry a lot of tension.
Mm.
And then, with the help of a student years ago, I created a version 3 that uses thumb 1, 2, and 3. And at that point, hopefully, your hand is working in harmony, and you can get quite far up the fingerboard if things are all going according to plan. And then my students know where all the half steps are, and then I start talking to them about, now, do you want to have a half step or a whole step between thumb and 1? And when can you safely have more than a half step between which fingers, and all that sort of stuff? So it has become, my part has become kind of methodical,
Mm.
but thanks to you, it's not boring. Because you'll remember a couple years back, I commissioned you to write a book of music that's in thumb position.
Yes.
And oh, my
Is
students
that
love
aiming
it.
high? Is
That
that
is aiming
yeah.
high. And aiming high is wonderful, because you did scaling the height, so it gets them through the danger zone
Mm.
into thumb position and back out, which is a
Yes.
great introduction. And then when they're really comfy in thumb position, I start working in the aiming high book with them, and everything there can stay in thumb position. It doesn't
Mm.
have to, but I really
Yes,
like them to
exactly.
stay up there. But I say to them, if you're getting tired, stop.
Mm.
Actually, I say stop before you get tired. But it gives them a lot of options, and it's nice music. It's good music.
Thank you.
It's not these boring half step exercises that I've tortured them with. Now you've got real beautiful music. So now I've blabbed a lot about it. How do you deal with teaching it? How did you deal with playing it when you finally got like a way?
Well, we're talking about when we first started with thumb position. I just remembered as I was listening to you talking, and suddenly, when Gary Carr came along, people started playing higher in higher registers.
Right.
And I remember in Britain, it was the attitude was from a lot of people: if you want to play high on the bass, why don't you play the cello?
Mm-hmm.
And then, well, in that case, if you want to play high on the cello, why don't you play the viola? It sort of
Right.
doesn't make any sense, because my attitude always is: you buy a whole piano, you may as well learn to use it. So,
Yes.
so why buy a whole bass and only use half of it? To me, it doesn't
Exactly.
make sense. The other thing I learned very quickly was that most string players end up in orchestras: violin, viola, cellos, and basses. But
Sure.
the violin, viola, cellos, they've learned all the sonatas, concertos, solo works. So when they join an orchestra, they have a fantastic technique.
Yes.
Now, I know the money positions for the bass are much lower. However, if you can play high, most people can play low as well. Um,
Yes.
and which is now bearing fruit, because most orchestras now have fantastic bass players, which
Right.
is really fantastic. So coming back to thumb position, I think Petrarchy, for me, revolutionized it, because he
Mm-hmm.
suddenly gave me a framework.
Yes.
And then when I started teaching, I used the basics of the hand shapes. So the 3 hand shapes: chromatic, semi-chromatic, diatonic.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've worked out 2 others. And one is called, I call it, what did I call it? I've written it down, so I've forgotten. Extended chromatic.
Okay.
And that's thumb on G, first finger A flat, and then B flat, second finger, and B natural.
Mm.
Because often you have that a hand shape. So
Yes.
that one, so they learn that one. And then the other one they learn, which is actually a really useful one, G, A, B flat, C. So I call that one
Hmm.
extended semi-chromatic. So you've got thumb, 1, 2, and it's the whole step between B flat and C, between 2 and 3, is such a useful one. And a lot of the
Yes.
time you don't need that, but just sometimes,
You need to be able to do it.
yes, it's a
Yeah.
perfect one. And I
Yes.
make my students learn the hand shapes, and I'll just say to lesson, okay, what are you doing? What have you practiced?
Hmm.
And they might say, I've done chromatic. So fantastic. So let's start on the D string. Well, I practiced on the G string. That's great. So let's play it on the D string. Um, and then they've moved forward, they've moved higher. So, fantastic. So, well, let's move back now. So instead of the thumb being on D, we move the thumb onto C sharp and then
Nice.
back to C. And it's
Yes.
just, I like getting them out of their comfort zone.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the other one I've developed as well as I've got older is it starts with chromatic, and then so the first finger's on A flat, thumb on G, then move the first finger to A, then move the first finger to B flat, and the first finger to B.
Mm.
And then so suddenly you've got G to C sharp in one hand shape.
Right.
G, B, C, C sharp. And a lot of the things we play, we suddenly have to go from a low note to a high note. And
Yes.
a lot of the time it fits into these hand shapes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just a logic to show them how to do it. And I love thumb position. I love when you asked me
Yeah.
to write the pieces. What was the one before? Scaling the heights.
Scale and the heights.
I
Yes.
love that because that was going in and out of thumb position.
Yes.
And that's something I teach a lot.
Well, and it's reality for us.
It is. It is. Even as an orchestral player, you will play in thumb
Yeah.
position.
Right.
That's the thing. So I enjoy that. And then when you asked me to write just in thumb position, just in treble clef, that was another challenge to
Yeah.
try. And again, I think I'm on the whole, it's moving by step.
Yes.
So you're not jumping so much. That can come later, but initially moving by step is hard enough. And playing in tune,
Yeah. Yeah.
maintaining the curved fingers and the bow
Yeah.
placement. That's
I
the other thing.
yes, and I tell my students doing, half steps and whole steps in your hand.
Mm,
Basically, I imagine it's like your brain is mapping out the fingerboard
mm,
and learning where all the notes are so that then you can do your leaps because
yes.
you've already filled in every half step. So if you have to go from a G to an E flat and you've done a lot of, whole step and half step work, you know where it is. Whereas when
Yes.
I first started playing in thumb position, I had no clue. I really didn't. And there's always this question. I was taught thumb position starts at that G harmonic on the G string, and of course, same location across
Yeah.
the other strings. I don't follow that at all. I can play in sort of what I would call like a thumb position format for my hand. So the thumb is on top of the string and I'm using thumb 1, 2, and 3. I'll go as far back as E flat or D on the
Mm,
G string if I need it. And it always sort of blows my students' minds because I say, why come out of thumb position if you're only going to play a few notes or if that passage works better keeping your hand shape of thumb position? There's no rule that I know of that says you
exactly.
can't do that.
But starting in with the thumb on G is a good
Yeah,
starting point,
it
isn't it?
is.
Moving forward,
Yes.
but then moving
Yeah.
back. And also as a stander, we talked about standing and sitting. This
Mm-hmm.
is a fantastic one for learning about the balance of the bass.
Yes.
Because when you move back, the balance changes again. Sitting is different because
Yeah.
on the whole, the balance doesn't change. But
Right.
standing is different. And as you say, it's if you learn it, it's in your armor if you need it. If
Exactly.
if you
Yeah.
don't need it, fantastic. But if you
Right.
do, you've got some idea. I use that one in one of my pieces, one of the Mallorcan pieces, the second
Mm.
one.
Yes.
And that the thumb I think moves
It
back to
does.
I think moved right back to D
Yeah, I think it
on the G
does.
string. I think it does. Um, but when I first started, I remember I got no control. Um, and we talked about thumb position, and it was just, as I say, just groups of notes up there somewhere, and
Yep.
you just hoped you're going to hit some of them.
Oh
Had
yeah.
no idea.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
then nowadays, it's I teach thumb position really early for my
Right.
students, just
Yeah.
so that it becomes normal, and I get them into the neck positions very quickly.
Yep.
And then if they can do one position, I move them a semitone higher, half step
Right.
higher. And then, it's so they're just moving a little at a time. It's just slightly out of their comfort zone, and then we move into thumb position. But if I hear, in a lesson, I'll say, okay, what have you been playing? So we'll spend a couple of minutes on thumb position, and if I hear it's okay, then I'll leave it because they're on the right
Right.
path.
Right. And
Um,
that it takes a little bit of time for them to build like the endurance and the stamina too.
yes, it does, and that callus, and I show them the callus on my thumb.
Oh yeah. I try to explain to my students too the difference between pain
Mm,
versus muscle fatigue because you're kind of growing new
yes,
muscles.
yeah,
And then the third option is I'm just literally burning my skin and creating a callus. I said, yes,
yes,
that's kind of painful, but you've got to start to differentiate. That pain is fine. Don't worry about that. It's when it's like, sharp shooting. Okay, something is going wrong. I said, if it's fatigued muscles, stop, give yourself a break, and then go back. And I remember every now and then, this last semester, I had a student that had never seen thumb position
mhm,
before. And so he came in one week and he said to me, "Oh, I'm in so much pain." I'm like, "Uh oh, okay, what's going on?" And he said, "The skin right here on my thumb, it burns." And I was like, "Okay, do you remember last week when I said to you, you're literally burning your skin, moving it around on metal?
yeah.
That's fine." And he looked at me and he said, "But it hurts." And I said, "I am so sorry, but I think you're just going to have to buck up because it's not bad pain. This is good pain. This is okay. This is just creating a wonderful callus for yourself." And he thought I was so mean, and I probably am. But
It's a
then I
glamorous
told,
instrument, the bass, isn't it? It's
oh, I
really
know,
fantastic.
right? Like
I love
digging
this.
ditches. So then I told him the story just to try to lighten the mood a little bit of when I was learning the Kuzovitsky Salon pieces with
Mm,
Ed Barker. He one day, he would give me fingerings,
mm,
suggestions, and he wrote thumb on a G sharp.
mm.
And at that point, I had only used thumb for harmonics. I was a serious newbie for thumb position.
Yes,
And so I stopped him and I didn't want him to think I was correcting him. I really was just looking for clarity. So,
yes.
I said, "Oh, excuse me, Mr. Barker." I said, "I just want to check something with you. You wrote a T, which I think means thumb, but it's a G sharp, not a G natural." And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Is that really correct?" And he looked at me like I was a moron, which is okay. It was fair. And he said, "Well, yes, that's the fingering. I just wrote it in." And I'm like, "Well, okay. I'm not that dumb." And I said to him, "Okay." I said, "It's just that I guess I never knew you could press down an actual note with your thumb."
But when you
And
start, you don't know that, do you?
right. And I
Yeah.
think it shocked him. And he just stood still for like a good 15 seconds looking at me. And I'm sure he was thinking, "Oh my God, what am I going to do with her?" And he looked at me and he said, "Well, now you know." I was like, "Okay." So I went, I left my lesson that week and I thought, "Oh dear God, how am I going to learn this?" And then I remembered I had that Petrarchy book
Mm,
and I was like, "Okay, it does. It moves around." And so this is when I started creating my own exercises
yeah,
because I knew I couldn't physically press down the string with just my thumb
yeah.
without straightening all my other fingers and tensing my hand. And I knew that
Mm.
wasn't right. So I thought, well, now I'm going to have to figure this one out for myself. And I did. And it worked. And now I use thumb alone all the time. But I make my students laugh by saying, like, here I was in college and I had no idea. Granted, it was a long time ago. The pieces that I was playing as a freshman in college and a sophomore, kids are playing freshmen in high school or even younger.
Yeah.
But times are different. But now, what do you do if a student comes in and plays thumb on the G natural,
Mm.
one on the A natural, two on the B natural, and three on the C sharp, but holding that posture without releasing anything to give your hand a break?
Yeah, you see, that's in the Petrarchy book. That's one of the
Yeah. Yeah.
the
I
sort
find that
of kind of
uncomfortable.
yeah, completely.
Yeah.
And I think it depends on your hand and flexibility, and that's
Mm-hmm.
something I would never teach because I think there's always a better fingering possibility
Me
than
too.
that. It's
Yeah.
having said that, it depends on your hand and the size of your base and lots of
Right.
things. But for me, I think that C sharp stretch.
Yes.
If
That's a
if I
killer.
thought if the first finger wasn't on A, if the first finger was on B flat,
Yep.
it's possible. But because it's the distance is so far,
Yeah.
Yeah, but it is in the book. Again, I think you have to rock the hand for that
That's
one.
what I have students, if they really want to do that fingering, if
Yeah,
there's a passage where those notes are necessary and you got to keep going back and forth between them, I
yeah.
have them kind of release their thumb and let it slide closer to one, which means they then have to re-find it,
Mm,
the thumb note, whatever the notes are that they're playing. Um, but for me, I say to them, holding that huge stretch from thumb to three for my hand is uncomfortable. But then this is where like personalizing things for each
mm,
student, which I really enjoy. I say to
mm.
them, if it's not causing tension in your hand, okay. And then I look at them, I say, but I think the odds are that it's probably too big of a stretch for most people. And
Yeah.
like you said, if it's a smaller base and a
Mm,
person with a bigger hand, it's probably
mm.
fine. But
But my when I first started, again, the thumb, as you same for you, the thumb was just on harmonics. That's
yeah,
how we were taught. Um,
yes,
but once I'd learned to control my thumb and stop it on any note,
yeah,
it was like a revelation. And
yeah,
suddenly everything is possible. And you suddenly realize all these different passages in the Botticini and Kusavitzky, they suddenly work and they're so much easier.
yes,
And everything keeps coming back. That's the nice thing about that music is there are only so many notes. And
right.
all these shifts and chords and intervals, they keep returning piece after piece. It might be Hindemith, or it might be Botticini, or it might be I don't know, Teppo or whatever.
Or
But these
David
things,
Hayes.
well, no, I doubt that. But these things keep coming back. And
Yeah,
once you have them under your hand, once you have this control, but I
yeah,
can remember none of us, I can't remember many of us having much control in thumb
no,
position when we were
no,
younger. But we all played in thumb position, I remember. You know,
right.
we were playing Bottesini, we were playing Kuzovitsky. I would love to hear recordings of us back then. It must have been
Oh,
abysmal.
well,
But I think about it.
I've always been conflicted about that whole thing because I think, everyone loved Bottesini's playing, so he
Mm,
must have had some seriously good technique up there and
yes.
throughout the whole bass. And then I think of like how many of us were kind of bumbling around because there was Petrarchy, but
Mm,
that wasn't working for everybody. There were no other alternatives that I knew of learning technique up there. And so we're sitting there all sounding pretty gnarly.
yeah.
I mean, oh my God, I do and I don't want to hear a recording of it.
Well, with the Petrarchy book, I don't use the book in teaching, but I
Right.
use the concept
Yes, me
because the
too.
three hand shapes I think are revolutionary.
Yeah.
Really, it's certainly revolutionized my life and
Oh,
my
sure.
students.
Yeah.
So I use that, but then I use my own exercises.
Me
So
too.
every lesson will include open one, two, four, sixes. So the first six notes of a major scale. So you've got two forward shifts, two backward shifts.
Yeah.
Thumb position, fourth position. So they're learning about the hand shapes and moving keeping the thumb in the place and moving the first finger. And thumb position, I love doing it because it suddenly opens up all
Yes.
the repertoire I love to play
So
and I
many
love to teach.
possibilities.
Yeah,
And
and it went with Botticini Elegy, and that's the first one really where suddenly they're finding that it's a great piece of music. After all the things they played, this really is a great piece of music.
right, right.
Mm,
They've gotten all these tools
yes.
and now there's a beautiful piece of music. And
Mm,
I think one of the other things that I find the students, because this is what I called it for me.
yes.
I say to my students, now you're entering what could be the howling dog region of the bass. We have to remember to move the bow closer to the bridge. You have to change the bow speed and your arm weight and all of these things. I call it the ABCs of sound: arm
Yes.
weight, bow speed, and then contact point, basically the location
Let
on
me
the
write that
string. And
down. That's very useful. Thank you for that.
it's very handy. I love it. I have it on stickers that I put in my students' notebooks because, well, then it's pre-written and I don't have to waste time in their lessons writing it. But
Exactly.
it's interesting because a student will come in and whether it's a piece or an exercise, it always has that kind of someone being strangled while they're trying to
Yes.
sing. And then I show them, I say, look, my bass has a 42-inch string length. When I'm playing in first position, it's now probably 41-inch string length,
Mm,
and my bow is below the fingerboard. Look at
yes.
that distance.
Mm,
Now, when I'm in thumb position, let's say I'm only playing like the G harmonic, the midway point. If my bow
mm,
is in the same location, I'm playing almost halfway down the string with my bow. And so, I teach them the motion, and I have them do it without the bass in their hands or with, but as their left hand goes
Yeah.
lower,
Mhm.
closer to the ground, so does the right hand. And I've heard some people say, like, there are only three places on the string where you'll play. I like it to be a little more gradual,
Mhm.
so that it doesn't get jerky. But I explain the regions on the string that you're playing. I actually, if I were to really quantify it, I have 5 regions on the string. But I get there with what I call on ramps. So I don't just jump to the next region, I get there
Yeah.
gradually, which may or may not work for everyone. It doesn't much matter, I don't think. But, we can work on the left hand technique, which I think for me, I usually focus on first. And then when their
Mhm.
strength is there, then they can think of something else and they start
Yes.
thinking about where to put the bow.
Yeah, this is difficult. You have exactly the same problem. I tell my students you have to do it all of the time. You're
Hmm.
having to think about hand shape, bow, position,
Yeah.
intonation, quality of
Yeah.
sound, phrasing, all these things. It's
Hmm.
really interesting. You're saying about the bow positions.
Yeah.
Years ago, I read an article in the Strad about Dorothy DeLay, the great violin
Yes.
teacher at Juilliard, and
Yeah.
she talked about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bow placement between the end of
Okay.
the fingerboard and the bridge. And I started implementing that with my students.
Yeah.
And 3 is midway between the end of the fingerboard and the bridge. So 3
Hmm.
will always give you a good sound.
Yeah.
1 and 2 much closer to the fingerboard, so you lose tone. It's
Hmm.
quieter. It's different.
Yep.
4, 5. So I always talk to them as they're playing. What number should your bow be sitting at?
Yeah.
Because we've talked about this all the time, and I'm really quite pedantic. Yeah, I think that's one of my great qualities, pedantry, if I'm honest.
It's
I've,
good though,
I've got
but
better at it.
when they switch from zone to zone, do they switch suddenly or is it a
No,
gradual?
no, it's like going through the gears of a car.
Yeah.
It,
Yeah.
if if you go smoothly through the gears, nobody notices the car
Right.
speeding up or slowing down. And
Yes.
this is the same thing. And
Yeah.
I teach them to listen because often they don't listen, because they're so worried about the technical aspect of playing. The
Yes.
last thing they can hear is what they're actually doing.
Right, right,
Um,
right.
but I say, once you start listening with my ears, suddenly you realize, oh right, yeah. And if it sounds good, then it probably is. So stick with what you're doing. If you're not
Right.
sure, it's probably not good. So
Yeah.
maybe rethink it.
Yeah. And what's interesting is I you and I spoke about the Dorothy DeLay
Mm.
zones,
Yes.
maybe a year or so ago, and I realized that that's what I've been doing, and I've probably heard it along the way and not really
Yeah.
thought too much about it. But it's always a gradual change. But when I look back at my playing, I would say for years I lived in zone 2, and
I think most people do. Most
yeah,
bass players
yeah.
do.
And then
Yeah.
I started playing solo pieces and I started moving to like zones 3 and 4. And I'll
Yes.
tell you, the year, it must have been what, 2018, when I gave the US premiere of Your Seven Last Words from the
Yes.
Cross.
Mm.
So I did that in Rochester. And right after that, I came to Boston, back home to Boston, and we were doing, I think it was Bartok Concerto for Orchestra, opening week with the Boston
Yes.
Symphony. And I remember I had changed officially where my bow was living on the
Yeah.
string.
Yeah.
And several players in the section turned to me and said, "Wow, you sound so good."
Wow.
And, that's not usually like, a huge, when you're a sub with the Boston Symphony,
Yeah.
they don't need to throw accolades at you. It's just not
Yeah.
a necessary thing.
Yes.
But I think it was 3 different people sitting around me, and I said, "Oh my God, am I not blending?" They're like, "No, no, no, you're blending, but your sound, what did you do? Your sound is great." And I was like, "Yep." It's just that
I
bow
do this.
placement.
I do this at workshops when we're doing. When
Yeah.
you first start a workshop, you don't know the people there, so you don't know how good they are. Because
Right.
it doesn't matter what they say on the form. When they send in the form, they're always 10
Yeah.
times better than they are in reality. So we
Right.
start with open strings, and then we do about bow placement, and they
Hmm.
suddenly hear if the bow's at 1 or the bow's at 4. Suddenly,
Yeah.
it sounds like the Berlin Philharmonic when you're at
Right.
4, and they're
Yeah.
astounded that you can make all these different sounds.
Hmm.
But this is just an early part of learning for moving into thumb position,
Right.
the bow
Right.
placement. Yeah.
Yes. And I think that I love to focus it first when it's new on the left hand, but I actually
Mm.
think the bow placement might in some ways be more crucial because otherwise the tone is so gross. And I remember hating practicing in thumb position because I hated how I sounded. And I went into a lesson one day and I said, my tone is disgusting. I need your help. I don't know what to do. And Ed's, Ed knew exactly what to do, but I had to sort of dig through his words to
Mm,
understand what he was saying was just bring the bow closer to the bridge.
yeah.
But I think
Mhm.
thumb position is just, it's great. It opens up so many possibilities on the bass,
Mm.
just being able to use the full range of it. And I think people are amazed and surprised when they hear our range is quite big.
Even in 2023, we're still evangelizing.
We sure are.
I'm still astounded, really, at how many people say, "Oh, I didn't know the bass could sound like that," which is really nice. But I love playing in thumb position and I love teaching thumb position.
Yeah, I do too. I do too. It's great.
Fantastic.
And I love when the students start to get it, how excited they get. Because I
Yes.
remember how I felt. It's just a wonderful, you feel like you're flying.
Yes. It's
It's great.
fantastic. Yeah,
I could
it's
talk
great.
about the yet another subject that I could talk about with you for hours. It's great. I love it. I love how we align, but we also sort of have different tacts at time too. It's really great, and I think it's enlightening for me certainly, hopefully for the listeners too.
And for me, it's fantastic to hear another perspective because it's all the
Yeah.
same. Thumb position is the same whether you're in
Right.
America or Britain,
Right.
but it's how we approach it and how we teach it and how we
Yeah.
use it is
Yeah.
fascinating. But we're all aiming in the same direction. That's the nice.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
We all have the same ultimate goal.
yeah, exactly.
And, to quote Gary Carr, bass is beautiful.
It certainly is.
It's wonderful. Well, this is great, David Hayes. I'm so happy. Thank you, everybody, for listening to Bass Talk with Hagen and Hayes. This was episode 5 about thumb position. And thank you for our sponsors for your generous support. Oh, wait. We don't have any yet. Or maybe we do. It is episode 5. Would you like to be a sponsor? Reach out. Let us know, and we would love to have you. I hope everybody stays well, and we'll see you soon. Bye bye.
Bye.